Yes. So welcome everyone. It's great to see there's so many people today. And today, it's a privilege to have our very own Professor Sterckx, Roel Sterckx, giving a presentation. He hardly needs any introduction. He's the Joseph Needham Professor of Chinese History, Science, and Civilization, who's been here for quite a long time. And he's worked on the animals and food. And his new book, Chinese Thought from Confucius to Cook-Ding, has come out last year. It's very, all our students are reading it now. And so I guess in addition to working on food, he's going to be looking at the other side of the food process today, talking about latrines and privies from Xuanquanzhi in Gansu province. So please welcome Professor Sterckx.
Thank you very much, Emre. Can you all hear me very well?
Yes.
Okay, so let me share the screen here. Well, thank you all, for being here in such great numbers. I wasn't aware that there was such a great interest in this particular subject. To give you a bit of history, this talk today is basically, the result of a footnote that is getting out of control, a footnote in a larger project, on agriculture. And so I suppose that is what happens during lockdown. You start something and then, you just can't stop but continue digging. Good. Now, on the slide here, you have, maybe I should actually, okay. I'll move the window away here. Okay, on the slide here, you have that site of Xuanquanzhi. These are the site of Xuanquanzhi, a relay post near Dunhuang. These are just some pictures I took down from the web, and Charles Sanft has introduced us to the site earlier in this series. Now, in 1992, when archaeologists were excavating here, they uncovered a privy toilet in the northern quarter of the site. So here is a map of the site. So the red star is just over the location of the privy on this site. And the receptacle of this particular privy contains some 200 wooden strips that were dated to the Eastern Han. And these were hygiene sticks that were made of wood and bamboo and wrapped in cloth, and they functioned as proto toilet paper. Now, here is a shot of them taken by some colleagues in Cambridge here, Piers Mitchell in the geography department, and his team have done some work on these. There were 7 sticks amongst these that had remnants of feces preserved on the cloth. Right here you have an example of this. And similar strips were found at other sites in the region, including Majianwan and 1 or 2 other sites. Now, here you do, if I move this up again, one of the interesting things that our colleagues, archaeologists, uncovered is while they were doing sample studies of the feces on these particular sticks, they obviously tabulated the parasites that they could be detecting. And one interesting parasite appearing in the remnants of these particular Xuanquanzhi sticks is the Chinese liver fluke, which is a parasite that normally only survives in damp and wet environments. So that would have been environments more akin to the east coast of China or Guangzhou. And so it is quite clear that parasites were traveling, together with the officials, the soldiers, and the travelers that came through Dunhuang. So that's a fascinating sort of parallel story to this. Now, that Passing travelers and soldiers garrisoned at the northwestern edge of the Han Empire availed themselves of bamboo or wooden slats for a wipe after relieving themselves may seem a very trivial addition to our knowledge of early Chinese sanitary habits. No mention of the practice is made in pre-Han transmitted texts. The technical word for these slips is usually 特筹 or 特简, but it's a term not attested in pre-Han or even Han text. And so it's very tempting to think that the custom came from elsewhere. The use of slats and wipes was known in India, and it may have become more widespread during the early medieval period as the Buddhist Vinaya gradually entered China. And for an unambiguous textual reference, we have to wait until the Tang period, the Fayuan Zhulin being the sort of earliest source in which it seems to be appearing. Now, a find of wooden debris in a latrine near Dunhuang, however, also gives cause for some reflection. Texts from pre-imperial and early imperial China, as you know, are replete with instructions on how we should cultivate the body, how we should preserve its vital energies through diet and through abstentions. Our texts are very generous with advice on how we should not soil the inner purity of the body, right? How we should keep everything in balance. But our sources have far less to say about what happens to the waste, to the filth, to the dirt and the muck that humans and non-human animals shed and excrete, and how to handle both the process and the product it leaves behind. Now, the olfactory and the tactile and the visual repugnance of what we excrete rarely invites comment in our texts. Now, we do, of course, in the archaeological record, have miniature terracotta figurines of latrines, the so-called Mingqi, which we will turn to a little bit later, that clearly belong to the visual repertoire of the time, but scenes depicting the place where people relieve themselves or of people or animals excreting are rare. Hand murals show banquets, feasts, and the kitchens that supply them, but not what happens to the physical needs of hosts and guests in between courses. So the question that sort of sparked my footnote then is what happened to, matters out of place, just to pay Mary Douglas here. What happened to matters out of place in a society where knowing one's place mattered so much? And so what I'll try to do in this talk is bring some of the evidence together here, and it will sort of bring us from an object to an animal to an idea. We'll start off with latrines, we'll move on to pigs, and very interestingly and intriguingly, we'll end up reading the Laozi towards the conclusion of today. Good. Now here we are. Let's start with excretion. In the year corresponding to 581 BC, the Marquis of Jin fell dead in his privy. In the Zhuozhuan record of the event, the verb xian, right, which you have here on your slide, suggests that the unfortunate Marquis stumbled into a waste hole in the ground. His servant followed his master in death once he had hauled him out of the privy. Now, this particular passage in the Zhuozhuan seems to be the earliest, perhaps, or certainly one of the earliest references to a ce latrine or toilet. Latrines in early China generally appear in 3 locations: within a screened off space inside a residence, in an annex to a building, as was the case with the Shenjianzhi toilet, or linked to the pigsty, as we will see later. They figure both in the private and in the domestic sphere, and there are some early references to latrines for public use. Here you have one from the Mozi, right? The Mozi talks about the provision of a latrine on the city's defensive walls at intervals of 1 in every 70 meters. And elsewhere in the Mozi, it's noted that on top of defensive walls, toilets should be built at intervals of 50 paces with another type of privy, the Hun privy, which you have here on your slide, built below the wall, presumably to gather the excreta coming down from the on the wall. The Mozi also mentions that those who enter the latrine should not be carrying anything. Now, there's another apocryphal story that features Laozi, right, so the patron of the Finanza, which possibly refers to public toilets. After his death by suicide, Laozi allegedly rose up to the realm of the immortals with his entire household, including his animals, and he was then ordered by the afterworld authorities to tend to the capital's toilets for 3 years, the so-called Du Ce. Now, there are several versions of the story, and some versions they talk about a heavenly toilet, a Tiance, but it's it's all basically organized around the same theme. You know, as a punishment, he is asked, you know, to sort of keep the toilets clean. Now, this term "ce" in the Zhuozhuan passage is one among several other terms for a privy or a latrine. Right here, you have some of them on the slide. Obviously, the Hun denotes the pigsty privy, right? Already explained in the Shuowen as a sort of a hui, an associative compound of a pig in a pen, right? Which is very clear if you look at some of the early versions, bronze, you know, jiagu, and then, you know, bamboo slip versions of the graph. And of course, replica earthen toilets, including pig pen toilets, have been found regularly in tombs. And we'll say a little bit more about these later. Other terms that occur are yen here, the sort of the recliner, which is a term which appears in an analogy in the Zhuangzi, and, you know, which is glossed by some of the commentators as a sort of a pingce, kind of screened off toilet. We are told in the Zhouli, you know, that, you know, the palace official, the gongren, sort of a palace attendant, who looks after the sleeping quarters of the king, needs to maintain the latrine. He needs to remove what is unclean, and he needs to get rid of unpleasant smells. 去其恶臭 is, you know, the expression there. There are several sources that link the latrine etymologically with an expectation for cleanliness. And that's why you see it explained, you know, even in Shuowen and in sources such as the Shiming and so on, as a qing, right? A privy, homophonous obviously with qing, which means clear and clean. And, you know, this is a term that regularly appears as an alternative for ce in the Han. There are other terms briefly, you know, in some of the excavated manuscripts, you know, some other terms appear here on your right-hand side in the green box. There's a few of these, a qiu, a zhu qiu, potentially even a qiong. Now, scholars, at least, you know, the paleographers, you know, are not entirely sort of agreeing with each other what they all represent. But if you just look at some of the versions, you know, of these graphs, you know, on bamboo, you can forgive some paleographers for, you know, having a bit of a debate, you know, as to whether or not these characters look very cognate, you know, to, you know, a character such as Hun and so on. What is more certain is that by Han times, another term appears for the first time here in Wangchong, the Lunheng, where the privy is referred to as a sort of geng yi zhi shi, you know, like a cloakroom, really. And that's a term then, you know, that, you know, appears, you know, in several other sources. So much for terms and terminology. If we then sort of, you know, move, you know, to some visual evidence, it's interesting that, you know, the sources document several interesting and notable encounters that took place in the privy. And, you know, Han Wuti here comes up trumps. You know, he allegedly has a romantic encounter in a lavatory with a concert lady, Lady Wei, during a tour of the empire. And in another episode, and these are both documented in Shiji Hanshu, in another episode, he receives a General Wei Qing, whilst he is squatting over a toilet. Now, it's hard for us to imagine what's going on here, but a line drawing here of a mural from this Eastern Han tomb in Anqiu shows a sort of a raised platform, a raised dairy, surrounded by a screen or curtains. Perhaps this is the sort of arrangement the emperor may have found himself in whilst receiving his guests. There are even discussions amongst the commentators whether or not, he was actually meeting Lady Wei or Lady Waits, I should say, in a mobile sort of toilet, in a chariot that was actually serving, as his private chamber, so to speak. While squatting over an opening seems to have been the most common physical posture, there's evidence that elites may have used proto toilet seats. So there is a wooden lacquered toilet seat we have from a Western Han grave in the Chu region, which is preserved in the Anji County Museum in Zhejiang, which is what you have on the screen here. Now, elites had servants waiting upon them whilst emptying their bowels. A rare Han mural from Yinan, right, shows this rail privy here to your left-hand side. Again, a rail on a platform, and unlike walled privies with a drainage hole and a gutter, which we will see later, the mural here shows sanitary utensils used to service the privy. And these sanitary utensils are known as xie qi in text, or sometimes also qing qi, right? So here you see the servant handling what looks like a water container here. This on the right-hand side is probably a urinal jar, which we will say a bit more about in a moment. And here, this servant is holding a kind of a wooden board, right, or a spatula with which to clear away whatever needs clearing away. And it's very interesting, right? If you go to the Sancai Tu Hui, and here, of course, we're in the 17th century, there's a sort of a representation of a ce, to be found in that text, which looks remarkably similar, actually, to the one we see here on this hand mural. Now, these sanitary implements, according to the Zhouli, were the responsibility of an official known as a yufu, or a storekeeper of treasures, who was in charge of valeting the king's clothing cabinet and his sleeping quarters. And amongst these xie qi, it is the so-called urinating jars that have a real tale to tell. And here you have some of these. Chunqiu period animal-shaped jars used for urinating have been preserved. And archaeologists amongst you might know more about this. I mean, they're sometimes referred to as shouzi, right? The cat here, shouzi, but there's no textual basis for the term shouzi until the 7th century AD, like sort of when Yan Shigu writes his commentary to the Hanshu. But there is evidence that by Han times, these jars were known as huzi, so-called sort of tiger jars or tidal urinals, right? And actually, Dunhuang in his commentary to the Shoan sort of explains them as part, of the regular sort of setup, of tools to be used. Tiger huzi is used to handle xiaobian, and a xingqing, which is a technical name again for, probably this wooden board, right? A clean sweep, something you use to clean it, is used, for the dabian. Now, interestingly, there are apocryphal stories surrounding this urinal, or this tiger jar, we should say. And actually, the origins of the jar are traced back to the famous General Li Guang, who allegedly during a mountain hunt shot a tiger, sliced off its head, and used its body as a pillow. And to display his might and his disdain, for the tiger, he had a bronze pot cast imitating the shape of a headless tiger. And the source here is Xijing Zaji, right? So it is a later source. It's according to the same source, the Han had luxury versions of the huzi, of the tiger jar, that were made, from jade. The one on the right-hand side is a later one. This is a 3rd century AD one. So these jars, adopt different names over time, and people who are more familiar sort of with, medieval China and the later period, might recognize some. Basically, the main for the purposes, for our purposes, the most interesting thing is that by the time we end up in the Tang, the huzi gets renamed, and it gets turned into, a mazi sometimes, and that's of course the result of a name taboo, with Emperor Jing, right, whose name was Li Hu, and obviously you can't name the jar and the emperor, by the same name. Good. Now here we are, Mingqi, toilet Mingqi, of course, these kind of terracotta figurines show up commonly in the Han archaeological record. And many of these show a privy annexed to a pigsty. And, despite earlier references to them archaeologically, but I'm not an archaeologist, so, I don't speak with authority here, but I have the impression from the literature that they appear to be a phenomenon, starting mostly in the late Western Han, with some samples dating to the Eastern Han, or with most samples rather dating to the Eastern Han. Possibly the oldest mention of a pig pen privy occurs in the Guoyu, which records that the mother of King Wen, Tairen, gave birth to the future king while passing water in the pig pen. Right, this is how the text says it. She's Shao So Yu Shi Lao. Now, of course, that could date these pens back, you could argue theoretically to the 7th century, but there's not much evidence beyond this one. These animal pens and these toilets within residential compounds tend to be located at the back of the compound on the northern yin side of a dwelling. And we know that this is, something, that had a significance from Qin period day books, right? The so-called Rishu, the ones we found in places such as Shuihudi, right? Where we learn that the Hun privy has to be to the northwest, or if it is rather to the northwest of the residence. It's beneficial for pigs, the text says, but it's not good for humans. The north is the most auspicious. And latrines ought to be located behind rather than in front of the building, this Mantic text adds. Now, curiously, and if any of you, are sort of know anything about this, I'd be very, very interested in learning more about it. But curious, there seems to be little evidence, archaeological evidence of these pig pen privies in medieval times, although it is hard to believe, of course, that toilet customs changed overnight. But anyway, up until the 1980s, historians of agriculture and archaeologists in China would frequently point out that this pig pen privy could still be seen in rural parts of China, as in the photo here on the left-hand side. What's so special about taking them into the tomb, along with miniature granaries, millstones, animal pens, wells? Are they simply part of the household furniture? And that is meant to cater for the physical needs in the afterlife? There are question marks rather than answers really here. Regionally, I have a feeling from the literature that these figurines are widespread. They have been found in tombs from Guangdong, Guangxi, Hunan, Hubei, Hebei, Guizhou, even further afield. They appear both in elite tombs and even in tombs of lower status. Some models show a pen and a privy linked up at the ground level, right, as in the top left here. And others are designed over 2 floors, right, where you've got the lavatory on top and then you have the pig pen underneath. Some of these are large enough to hold 4 to 5 pigs, and some models even suggest, right, on the right-hand side here, that, that elite Han households had separate sort of cabinets for ladies and gents. This, of course, is a different. These are miniature Ming Qi, right? So this is a funerary good. This is not the same as the type of, I suppose, lavatory compartment that we see in some elite tombs, such as here in the tombs of the true princes of Xuzhou, right? That had areas that contained separate bathrooms, right? And toilet compartments for use by the tomb occupant in the afterlife, right? This is an example actually which we had on display here in the Fitzwilliam Museum some years ago. Now the function of these so-called interlinked privies has invited speculation. The most obvious hypothesis is that they were designed to produce, gather up and accumulate pig manure. And the inference there is, of course, that pigs were raised to produce manure. Another theory, and that was first put forward by Japanese scholars in the 1920s and adopted by the great historian of agriculture, Amano Motonosuke, he sort of thought, he argued that these privies were designed to facilitate pigs to feed on human night soil. Now, while pig pen privies probably served both to collect pig manure and to have pigs process human excrement, the feeding of human excreta to pigs was not free from controversy. There are some, albeit mostly later sources, that corroborate that human waste was fed to animals, dogs and pigs, in particular. The Li Ji suggests that animals raised in or near a privy were not favorite foodstuffs. Right, here's this line, a gentleman does not eat the belly fat, of a pen-fed pig, right? This is sort of, a take on belly pork, really. It's very interesting. Commentators tend to take, Huan here, right, the character for the privy, very often as, a variant for Huan, right, which means something like to feed. And obviously in both of these graphs, you can see a distinct link with the pig. Now, Zhongshuan comments that, that Huan includes pigs and dogs, and adds that some, and that's his line here, some belly fat resembles human feces, right? Yeah, Ren Hui. So, the belly of the pig has been too close, obviously, to anything, that's lying around in the pig pen, and therefore, it is quote unquote tabooed. But terms, of course, such as hui here, right, filth, weed, or feces, as well as, obviously the pig, the huan itself, or huan with the water radical, which means something like foul or muddy, they belong to this extensive vocabulary denoting forms of pollution in warring states and Han texts, that Robin Yates, has written about this, some years ago. Now, Wang Chung, for instance, he attempts to debunk a belief that when humans eat or drink soiled food, heaven gets angry and will strike them down with lightning. By contrast, he says, dogs and pigs who feed on human waste do not incur such wrath. It's not clear whether Wang has in mind rotten food waste or human excrement or both, but later sources confirm a belief that consuming excrement or drinking urine results in punishment in the form of lightning. There's a passage in the Taiping Jing, right, that states that humans who eat human feces and drink urine rank beneath pigs and dogs. And there is similar evidence of this, surviving into the Tang. And in stories, mostly collated in later encyclopedia, they corroborated pigs were obviously fed human excrement. And I could pull up one from a text, not very familiar to me, but potentially a Jin text known as the Foods. And this is in the Taiping Yulan here, where the story occurs. We have a story, of a gift of a pig that's given to, the old King Zhao of Yan, a pig that weighs in 1,000 jin, and this giant pig, also known as the sort of Shixian, the pig immortal, which was transformed from a human. It was gifted with the following instruction, which you have here in Chinese: unless you have a large cesspit, the pig won't keep in it. Unless you feed it human waste, it won't value it. And while, as we will see a bit later on, excrement, of course, was also thought to contain medicinal powers, it's not clear whether those properties were a factor in using human night soil, as pig feed. At any rate, for a wild boar who was in need of something extra, the privy could offer good takings. We have several stories of wild boars entering, the privy, most famously when Emperor Jingdi, right, walks around, a concubine, and then, sort of arrives at the toilet. And this is in the Shanglin Park, where, the poor lady, is faced by a wild boar in the toilet, in the middle of events. And there are several stories, that attest to these sort of pigs and wild boars roaming around and entering latrines. Now, here is an interesting aspect attached to some of these latrines: the architecture of the Pig Pen Privy. Some of the examples that you've just seen just now. The architecture also provides, interestingly, an escape route out of a residential compound when danger lurks. And it's very interesting, just like pretending to be drunk, right, or pretending to be ill, or excusing yourself from a banquet, right, going to the privy, right, Ru Ce, appears as an excuse to get out of a perilous situation. Right, Liu Bang famously got up to go to the toilet during the banquet at Hongmen, right, without parting officially from Xiang Yu, who stood ready to have him and his followers murdered on the spot. From the latrine above a pig pen, right, one could access, climb over, or jump off the encircling pig pen wall, or less clinically, sneak out through the sewage hole that connects the upstairs latrine to the pig pen, or the pig pen to the outside, or both to the outside. And so we have these references, that make that talk about the Ce Dou, right? Here, the latrine hole, the cavity in the latrine, which, according to Xu Guang, right, a commentator to the Shiji, was a hole through which dirty refuse was drained away. And if you look at some of these Ming Qi, Eastern Han Ming Qi, you see them sort of, they show up as a hole, or sometimes as a keyhole shaped opening, right? Round or oval at the top, square or triangular at the bottom, and located near at the bottom of the privy or of the pig pen. This is a line drawing from a Ming Qi from Guangzhou. Now, the latrine hole was designed to be large enough to drain both fluid and semi-fluid dung and night soil while preventing the pigs from escaping. However, judging by the number of documented incidents involving stray pigs, some clearly managed, to get out. Now, that the pig hole, right, or the latrine hole, rather, here, was known as a potential route in or out of a residence can also be seen in calendrical texts known as these day books. And we go again here to Shui Hu Di, right? The day books there, where we have this, wonderful robber calendar, right? A calendar, a mantic text helping you to predict, or identify robbers according to, the duodenary cycle in the calendar. And here is the entry, of what you should be doing, or who might be actually invading, sneaking into your house during the high month, right? The pig month, right? The text is, in that particular month, the animal is the pig, and those who steal, right? The robbers who might have a go at entering your property, they have a big nose and they are slender and they have a long spine and their face is not complete. They have a blemish on their waist, and here we are. They hide in the pig pen beneath the wall, and so you can catch them early in the morning, but not at sunset. And then the text sort of gets muddled up. These are probably names, for these particular robbers. And similar examples occur elsewhere in the daybooks at Fang Ma Tan. The pig month robber is one who hides amongst the excreta in the pig pen. He's said to have red eyes and whiskers. And the Shui Hu Ti daybooks also mention taboo days, for the building of pig pen privies. Now, it's quite interesting, that you have this sort of cycle of stories of people who are trying to get in or get out, through the Tidal, through the sort of latrine hole. And, sometimes these kind of narratives are very, very sort of akin to general sort of narratives where piercing a wall or scaling a wall is dismissed as somehow untoward, right, or unethical conduct. Mencius, of course, most notably disapproves of young people, right, boring holes or scaling walls to meet each other, clandestinely, right? Now, as much as the privy could offer a way out of a difficult situation, it is also the recurring setting for dealings with rivals. And many a poor soul, it appears, found his or her end while going to the privy. Some are stabbed, some are pushed into the dark or shady corner of the house. Others are thrown to the pigs that scavenge in the vicinity of these latrine pits. And Empress Liu Ho is most famous there. She notoriously cut off, Lady Qi's hands, tore out her eyes, burned her ears, numbed her with poisonous potion, and then she throws her in the privy, calling her the human swine, the 人士, right? Leaving her disgraced and polluted, which then leads to Emperor Hui, to take to alcohol as a result. And there are several of these other stories, narratives in which ending up locked away in the privy or falling into it often figures as some kind of form of retribution or an anomaly. And this, in a way, is not surprising because, of course, the privy and everything that surrounds it was an area, a space that was also haunted by ghosts and spirits. Right? It's the place where you open the body up, right? Where you excrete, and where you are vulnerable to demonic forces. Fragments of a Western Han daybook, actually from that same site at Xuanquanzhi that we started with, suggest that the latrine was a hiding place for inauspicious forces, right? It contains an incantation to be pronounced when entering a toilet, accompanied by the performance of a ritual or ritual steps, rather, known as the pace of Yu Bu. And then later Buddhist sources, make mention of ghosts feeding, on excrement, right? And that's the sort of materials that, Anne Herman and Mathieu Torck at Ghent, have done some wonderful work on. Raymond Kolb, right, a German scholar, has studied references to latrine demons from medieval times to late imperial times, and more specifically to references to the latrine goddess, right, known as Zigu, Lady Zigu, and other deities linked to the privy. These are just, images that I've pulled off the web here, together with a picture here, from set somewhere in a household in Taiwan, right, where offerings are still offered to the privy, to the spirit of the privy. Now, this spirit, just following Kolb's study, appears possibly in the Jin period, but certainly from Tang times onwards. There's actually one tradition that links the spirit to the unfortunate lady that Empress Liu threw into the pig pen. But at any rate, the link between the pig and the toilet survives in later lore, where the latrine spirit sometimes appears in the shape of a pig. And then later on by Song times, by Yuan times, this pig-shaped latrine spirit was well embedded in popular belief. To be exposed to it is usually a bad omen that results in death. Now, another interesting, I suppose, label under which references, to excreta, right, appear is, in references to toilet customs or customs of, I suppose, non-Han people, but people who don't belong to the cultured heartland, in which the sources, that describe them were written. And here is an example from the Ho Han Shu describing the people in the land of Elo as pig raisers. They're dressed in pig hides. They're coating their skin with pig sweat to protect against the cold. In the summer, they're naked with only a small piece of cloth covering their front and behind. And then the text says its inhabitants, right, are chou, right? They are filthy, they're smelly, 不洁, they're not really, I suppose hygiene is never a good way of translating this term, but sort of it comes close to that. But here is interesting. They actually construct the privy, Yuzhong, right, in the center of the settlement in which they live. And then actually they live in a circle around it. So again, here you see pigs and places, of course, of human defecation are very clearly linked to each other. And that, of course, didn't escape, the early observers, who traveled to China in the 19th and early 20th century, because, they took note of the fact that, in China, what ends up in the latrine or the Pig Pen Privy was waste, but it was never wasted, right? And Western and Japanese visitors to China were struck by the sight of human manure, right? And also by air, that was obviously redolent with the stench of human excreta. So John Francis Davis, right, who was to become the second governor of Hong Kong, makes a note of it here in his general description, right, of the Empire of China, and obviously flags up the fact that the dung of all animals, but especially night soil, is esteemed above all, and then makes a comparison, with Columella, the Romans. Another example is this gentleman here, Franklin H. King, who's a fascinating figure. He's an agricultural scientist who in 1909 went on a tour, of East Asia, and then wrote this book, Farmers of 40 Years. And he made photographs, and his photographs show, among others, manure boats in Suzhou ferrying human waste out of Shanghai, destined for the fields, and stone-baked receptacles and pits in which human night soil was held. You see, this is the picture he includes in that book of these receptacles in the fields where human waste was gathered. And of course, in China, human excrement, of course, was an agricultural commodity, right? And its collection and agricultural use only really became a sanitary concern in the last few decades of the Qing, after the introduction of Western concepts, of public health, about which scholars such as Yong Xue and so on have written. Now, the night soil and manure trade is well documented, for late imperial China, but evidence suggests that its history goes back to early times. Oracle bone inscriptions already refer to human waste, right, to dung or to excrement, and they include an early form of the graph for human excrement, of course, which seems to be showing a person squatting over droppings, of excreta. Xunzi mentions that the director of the marketplace has to dispose of dung and night soil. And more recently, in the Qin materials held at the Yuelu Academy, right, the Yuelu Shuyuan, the legal materials there, dating roughly, dating post 221 BC. But in the statutes of finance in these materials, there's an entry that acknowledges and illegalizes the trade of tiles, of earthen bricks, and of manure, fen, from individual workshops or residences. So not from official markets, but you could trade it actually from, I suppose, through your own window. And so Qin authorities seem to have condoned local and small volume trade of manure, probably because perhaps it was of relatively low value, or perhaps to avoid having to transport it in bulk, to the market over a great distance. There's also evidence of night soil sales, among the Juyan slips. And of course, if you look at other sources of the period, here is an example of a line, from this kind of mnemonic primer, right? The Jijiu Pian Han period primer. you know, where you see these characters in one, so ping, ce, qing, hun, fun, tu, rang, right? Which basically reads something like screen, privy, toilet, latrine, dung, soil, humus, right? So it's quite clear that people made the link between night soil and the treatment of soil. And although night soil collection and dung picking were nowhere as prevalent in early China as it would become in the urbanized centers of late imperial China, excreta were clearly already viewed as an agricultural commodity very early on. The most used fertilizers were animal and human night soil, and the character denoting fertilizer, or let's see, the most recurrent graph denoting fertilizer is fun, right? As you have it here in its various versions, which was of course the same character as that for dung. And we do have some, I suppose, origin stories that set the fertilizing powers of night soil in an idealized past, and associate this kind of sort of with a natural with a natural economy, so to speak. The Wu Yue Chunqiu is a source here, which has this wonderful story where the point is made that in ancient times, in the times of the Xia, right, fruits would sprout out of night soil relieved by humans in the wild, right? It talks about King Wu, right? And he's discouraged from eating a melon, that he found near the roadside because it was polluted. And then his advisors claimed that during the height of the legendary Xia dynasty, people would just eat fresh melons and then open their bowels on the roadside. And then, of course, melon seeds would sprout again. So it's quite clear, that sort of, I mean, these are retrospective stories, mostly sort of late warring states and even, Western Han, but sort of people want to sort of link this to a naturalness of the past. From the mid-warring states period onwards, reference to use of liquid or solid night animal waste and night soil to improve soil quality is increasingly prevalent. We see it in most of the agricultural treatises and some of the Yuelin calendars of the time. And very interesting also, we see descriptions of this practice known as, fenzhong, right? You fertilize, you dress the seeds, which basically means you use a concoction derived from, manure, animal excreta, or animal fats, right? And then you dip your seeds in there. The famous Fan Shengzhi Shu, right, this agricultural manual, we have credits, Yi Yin with the invention of this technique. What's interesting too is that we see, by warring states times, references to manuring and using manure on the fields increasingly used as, metaphors by philosophers, right, which is always a sign that obviously, it was a practice that was being observed. On the top here is a line, I should say, attributed to the Mencius, but not transmitted, not transmitted in the Mencius we have, but in the Shuoyuan or the Shuiyuan. So it's a bit of doubt, of course, about the particular passage, but it's quite clear what it says, right? It says here, that people know, right, how to fertilize their fields, but nobody knows how to fertilize their hearts, right? How to sort of cultivate the self. And then the next one here is a example in the Xunzi, right, where disciples of influential teachers, right, are being, I suppose, compared with leaves fertilizing the roots, right? So when the water is deep, right, whirlpools or something, or eddies, right, form, and when plants sheds, or when a plant sheds their leaves, they funban, right, they fertilize the roots. And when disciples, make profit from, I suppose, taking up office, they should remember their teachers, and so on. Now, interestingly, and of course, certainly not unknown to the historians of medicine amongst you, is of course this use of fertilizer of animal excrement as sort of as medicine, or at least as a substance that has healing or apotropaic powers. This is very common in the early in the text in the late warring states, and early imperial text. Dog excrement, appears in the Shui Day books, at Ma Wang Day, right? Wushar Bing Fang, you have the urine and the feces of rats, sheep, dogs, pigs, chicken droppings. And of course, famously, to some of you might use the story in your classes of classical Chinese, right? The story in the Han Feizi where a lady and her housemates cover up an affair by making her lover storm out of the bedroom naked and disheveled to simulate so-called demonic delusion, right? And then the husband, the poor guy, is told to bathe himself in excrement in order to sort of rid himself, from the idea that his wife was having an affair with somebody else. The medical formularies found, by the way, at Wu Wei, which is also in the same region really, contain a coldness remedy that involves fumigating or burning excrement of white sheep. And there's evidence of the use of children's urine to treat the effects of poisonous plants, and of a belief that pigs and dogs do not perish from poisoned arrows because they feed on excrement. And that's an idea that goes back again to Wang Chong's observations above. And then, as the medieval specialists amongst you will know, I mean, there are obviously there's more evidence for later medieval times, right? In Longmen, right, the so-called, the Longmen found the recipes, carved on the northern wall, right, of a cave in the Longmen grottos, right, contains 17 recipes that use the excrement and the urine of different animals, including swallow droppings, horse and chicken manure, donkey, sheep, cow, dog droppings, and the urine of a black ox. Here, well, you have some samples here, which I sort of borrowed from a very recent paper by some Chinese scholars who've been studying actually references to these so-called fecal medicines in traditional Chinese medicine, or at least as they appear in the text, and then with these samples. So it is clearly quite common. And if we then go back to Dunhuang, right, in Mogao, right, cave number 17, there were, of course, over 100 medicine-related manuscripts there, and Catherine Despeux had a very careful look at these. They were, she said, she counts about 30 manuscripts amongst the medical ones with feces that mention, the use of feces. And she tabulated that it mentions the use of feces from about 17 different species of animals, mostly domestic animals. Plus, she comes to the conclusion then that they appear most prominently in texts with a Buddhist influence, which suggests that Buddhism played somehow a role in their circulation. Now, interestingly, the single most debated occurrence of the term fun, or the graph fun, dung manure, in early Chinese texts occurs in, I suppose, in commentaries and in interpretations of this particular line here, this particular verse from the Laozi 64, right? The text, which is fairly clear, right? When the Tao prevails in the world, you withdraw, zoma, your fast horses, potentially your war horses, and you use them in order to fun, right? To fertilize the fields. And when the Tao obviously is absent in the world, then barbarian horses, or war horses are bred in the borderlands. Now, historians of agriculture and commentators on the Laozi over the centuries have speculated at length about the technical implications of the second line in this verse. Laozi 64's Dung is a good example of how different disciplinary interests can incite commentarial fervor, which on balance, one could argue, goes round in circles, or alternatively, you might argue simply articulates the obvious. I won't go through all the detail, but I'll take you along to some of this, some of this story. The earliest allusion, to this particular verse, the second line here on your slide, occurs in the Yan Tie Lun, late Western Han, which notes that at the time of Yu the Great, farmers were using horses for plowing and transport. And then the text says, amongst the people, there were none who did not ride them. And in those times, war horses were retired and used for manuring. Now, that's obviously an allusion to this particular line. Now, the passage offers little in the form of historical evidence. Its purpose, of course, mostly being to invoke a golden age inspired by the Laozi line. Now, horse plowing is attested at Juyuan and also in the Yuelu Shuyuan statutes, but archaeological and pictorial evidence dating to the pre-Qin period, is scant. There's some, but not that much. There have been scholars, and I should go back here to my slide here. There's some scholars who've been arguing that, that fun, can be glossed as poor, right? This graph poor here suggesting that horses somehow are used in the fields to help set out the seeds, but etymologically, this reading is probably questionable, simply because the characters, rarely occur as graphic loans or variants. The graph fun itself seems not very common in pre-Qin text, and it's only by Eastern Han times, the period actually of the terracotta latrines, that fun seems to be used regularly to refer to human excrement and urine. So the graph probably, evolved, or the meaning of the graph rather, probably evolved over time, right? Another hypothesis here about the verse in the Laozi is that it refers to plowing over the seeds or seeding a field, or that we ought to imagine horses manuring the fields, either naturally or by pulling cartloads of manure to distribute across the fields. Now that's very interesting. That interpretation goes back to Zhu Xi, who recounts in his, Zhu Yulei, that actually he observed a horse pulling a manure cart, a fen che, in Jiangxi. And of course, once Zhu Xi makes a mention of it, then of course, that feeds a whole frenzy of commentary, of interpretations of it. The problem, of course, is that there's no mention of a cart in the Laozi in the first place. And ultimately, the line in question could merely serve, as a sort of a metonym, right, for agricultural work in general, in the spirit of the verse, which is, of course, clearly about retiring war horses for farm labor. But dung collection behind horses is attested. We see these, in the Zhuangs, obviously, there's this famous passage where it's used, sort of metaphorically, but obviously we have these murals here from Shanxi, right, where clearly people are scooping up things behind their horses. It's, however, very difficult, of course, to link any of these murals in any way, to anything that comes close, of course, to the Laozi. Later agricultural manuals mention the use of horse manure on the fields, but I'm not aware of this being very common, in the early period. Now, less controversial is the philosophical reading of this stanza. Right? Once the Tao prevails, warfare no longer has its place. And horses, of course, normally requisitioned for battle, are set loose for pasture. And so decommissioning horses to the fields is how, the Yulao and the Jielao commentaries and the Finanza read it, right? On the top, you've got basically the Jielao explanation of the verse, right? The gist of which is the final one here, right? When the way prevails on the heavens, swift horses are withdrawn to fertilize the fields. That's the actual verse, right? But the idea is clear, right? So a ruler does not deploy horses to travel back and forth in warfare, and people do not use horses to transport extravagant luxuries to and from distant places, right? Instead, the horse's strength is preserved exclusively for agricultural pursuits. And if horses' strengths are, of course, preserved for agricultural pursuits, they will invariably be used for manuring and irrigating the fields, right? So this is the Jielao explanation. We have a similar explanation that appears in the Finanza, where, the sort of the sage, right? The non-intervening, non-interfering Wu Wei type of sage is somebody who retires his horses to fertilize the fields, and whose chariot tracks, don't extend beyond 4 lands. So it's a very, recognizable image. And of course, if you look at the early commentaries on the Laozi, the He Shang Gong here and then Wang Bi, we see that they roughly agree, right? But interestingly, in the He Shang Gong commentary, right, manuring means fertilizing the fields. Once weapons and armor are no longer used, right, one retreats war horses to cultivate agricultural fields. And then the analogy comes in, and this is interesting, 自身者, right, those people who cultivate the self, right, I'm not too sure what to do here with, Xue obviously means they withdraw, but then of course Yangjing, they withdraw yang energy, but the most important thing here is yi feng qi shen, in order to fertilize, their person, their selves. So you see here, fertilizing the fields, all of a sudden here is extended. It becomes a bit like in that sort of passage attributed to Mencius, a way to fertilize oneself. It's Taoist self-cultivation. And so when the Tao prevails on the heaven, the Wang Bi commentary says, and one understands satisfaction and knows when to stop. And so one does not seek for things externally, but each cultivates one's inner self, right? And that's all. Therefore, one retires the war horses and uses them to treat the fields with manure. You see, it's all in this same atmosphere of self-cultivation. And so it seems here then, we're sort of come full circle, right? We start off with excreta as waste to be shed and to be left untreated, to manuring the fields, and then to fertilizing the self in a Taoist act of self-cultivation. So, we've got these references to excreta and excreting sort of operating along three lines, right? On the one hand, at one level, they are polluting. There are things that need to be dejected. There are literally waste, right? And that's the whole culture, of course, of the toilet as this tabooed space. And the next level, of course, it is, excreta, and relieving oneself operates in that middle zone, right? In between danger and comfort, right? It is something that can help you. It's relieving yourself. It's actually even potentially medicinally a good thing to ingest. But be careful, because of course there's always that danger of demonic influences haunting both the body and the toilet space. And then towards the end here, and that's actually very interesting. In once we read these comments here to the Laozi and the lines, the analogies by some of the metaphors in some of the philosophers, we see, of course, excrement, we see excreta here as a force that feeds, that actually feeds seeds, that creates new life, right? That is actually economically valuable, right? It's like money, right? As they say in later imperial China. So it's fascinating to see, that although, the subject of excretion really isn't appearing anywhere in any systematic form in our texts, by putting some of these snippets together, there clearly is a great deal of information across these multiple types of sources. It's a subject matter which tends to be sort of out of place on the regular menu of sinologists, but obviously being a basic need of all human and non-human animals in the societies we study, we must assume that this was matter that mattered, right? And the Xuan Quan Zhi sanitary sticks are a poignant reminder of these. And I leave you here with this famous dialogue, from the Zhuangzi, right? The conversation that he has with Dunhuang, who asks him, so where is the Tao to be found? And of course, Zhuangzi concludes in the end, you can find it in the excrement and in the urine, right? So this passage has its own agenda, but in a way, it's perhaps quite telling, as an image. Now I realize that most of you are either about to have dinner or lunch, depending on what time zone you are. So I should probably stop spoiling your lunch, and I will leave it here. Thank you very much for your attention, and please do do not shy away from offering your comments, suggestions. I'm sure there are people amongst the audience who can plug significant gaps in what I've just put together here for you. But thank you very much.
Great. Thank you very much, Roel, for this very interesting and very rich talk. So I open the floor for discussion. Maybe if I don't see you, if I don't notice you, just speak up, unmute yourself and speak up. There were a couple of comments already in the chat, Roel.
Oh, thank you very much. Yeah, I've got the numbers of my Laozi. The other way around, it's 46, not 64. That's good to know. Thank you.
Perhaps can I join in?
Yes,
May I
yes,
join in?
please.
Thank you. It's truly wonderful and such a rich presentation. Thank you so much. You probably are aware that in India, cow dung is very, very important in rituals. And I'll just mention that esoteric Buddhism served as a vehicle through which the significance of cow dung in India entered China. If you look at if you run the Tripitaka catalog, you just do Neo-Fen, there are dozens and dozens of references. So I guess, yeah, so it entered China during the medieval period, the significance of cow dung. It entered Chinese rituals. Yeah, but I just mentioned this.
Yeah, thank you very much. I mean, I'm actually, my colleague, Sanskritist, only recently put me on to reading the Arthasastra, right, in translation, obviously, where you see some techniques like fertilizing seeds, right, with these liquid concoctions of dung are described almost in the same way as you have them in ancient Chinese sources. So it's quite clear that of course, India, as we all know, right, was very much using manure as well, you know, as part of agricultural practice, yeah.
And it entered into religious rituals. That is to say, cow dung is very important in esoteric Buddhist rituals.
Yeah. Fascinating, yeah.
Yes, there are actually references in Xuanzang, both Xuanzang and Faxian. I think they talk about cow dung.
Yeah.
Okay, we have a question also from Jacqueline.
I think the question was answered. So because I just want to know why professors wanted to look at this particular topic, because it's so special. I mean, generally we won't be research in subject like this, you know. So, but now I think I got the answer after the comment.
Okay, and so we have, I think next one's Flavia, and then Oliver.
Yes, thank you so much, Professor Sterckx. I found it very interesting and a lot of unexpected discoveries, I think. So I have many questions, but I think I'll just ask one. So you mentioned this text that talk about the concerns of excreta, and I think I've also read some elite, like in medieval times, like elites talking about how they care about this, keeping the sanitary aspect of going to the toilet, and they aromatize themselves after going to the toilet, which is very interesting. But I also wonder if you have come across any text that talks about from the state's perspective, like the government's perspective, like the state's concern about sanitation or hygiene, kind of related to excreta, and which moves to any change of practices, anything like that.
Mm-hmm. Thank you. Well, I mean, the simple answer is no, unless, of course, you know, you take these references to these tasks of these officials in the Jolie as somehow referring, you know, to a real status. I mean, clearly, it was on the radar, but it doesn't seem to be. It doesn't seem to be sort of, you know, a wide concern yet, although of course the fact that in legal statutes here and there you find regulations, you know, on the use and on the sale of manure, you know, that suggests, of course, that the state, you know, had an interest in somehow regulating it. But the evidence for the warring states in early imperial period, to my knowledge, there's not much evidence out there.
All right, so Oliver, and then Jeffrey and Anne.
Hi, yeah, thanks so much for your talk. It was very, very interesting. I don't really have, this is not something that's based on like deep research or anything, but I just was thinking about, you know, you said that bit from the Hershang Gong that mentioned Che Yang Jing, blah, blah, blah. And I was wondering, do you think there's maybe, this reference to Yang Jing, do you think it's possibly something to do with yin yang ideas, and that yang is associated with the liu fu, or the, you know, the 6 bowels or whatever they're called? Do you think there's possibly a connection there? It's just simply something off the top of my head.
Who knows? I mean, it's hard to, I mean, I have a feeling that maybe it might just be it might not even refer to yang, you know, it might actually be used verbally or something. You kind of, you raise your jing or something, you get your jing up to a level that it actually sort of helps you in cultivating the self. I don't know whether there's a connection with, you know, with any yin yang kind of scheme here, but always a good question to ask.
Yeah, just a thought.
Okay, Jeffrey.
Well, my comment is, as you expect, the comparability with what goes on in the Greco-Roman world. There's less attention to the question of manure in agriculture, although that reference to Columella is one exception. But what is very well developed is the use of excreta of one kind or another in medicinal, in drug recipes. This has been quite heavily researched under the name, the euphemism Dreck Apotheker. It's not a euphemism, but you go into a foreign language to hide a certain embarrassment sometimes. But it's everywhere in the sources when people talk about recipes for different kinds of diseases. The person who's written about this is a guy called von Staden. And if you wanted to follow up, you haven't got the time to follow, but if you wanted to follow up the Greco-Roman sources, I could give you a reference. Just a comment, not a question. Oh, well, actually,
Thank you.
There's one other thing. I mean, when it comes to your different levels, I mean, it's part of the resonance of the term saka, from which we get sacred, that it is on the one hand positive, but on the other hand also negative. It's what is not profane. What is profane is everyday and ordinary, and something that is extraordinary can have either a positive or a negative valence.
Thank you very much, Jeffrey. Yeah, I know there's quite a bit out there on sanitary provisions, you know, in Roman and even Greek antiquity. It's
yes.
actually quite amazing, you know, the kind of imbalance. You know, if you look at what's been done. I mean, archaeologists obviously have looked at these Ming-Chi, and I'm aware of one history of the toilet, you know, written by a Chinese scholar, but it tends to be this sort of wide survey, and of course there's very recent attention in the development of public health, you know, and toilets, of course, in 1950s and 1960s China. So there's quite a bit out there.
I suppose one question that arises, if these procedures are very common, do we have to think of influence, or do we think of alternative development of similar ideas? It's a recurrent problem, of course. Very difficult to know how to resolve it.
Yeah. I mean, I don't know. I'm not a specialist, but obviously there's several Buddhist specialists amongst the audience here, some of whom have written actually, you know, on some of these practices in Buddhist sources. It seems, you know, it really does seem that, you know, you do get much more, you know, once you move into the medieval period, right? in terms of information. The thing that I found striking, if you look at sort of the pre-Buddhist sources, is that now and then when you see a reference, to how to behave or how to handle, the sanitary space, that it is linked, to some kind of, human morality, right? Famously, Li Si, right, the chancellor, the later sort of chancellor under the first emperor, right? He, at one point in the Shiji, right, he's absolutely disgusted, by the state of the latrines, used by, people, like in the palace, and that, then, encourages him, to turn into a really good official, later on in life. His disgust with dirt actually morally kind of cleans him up, right? And even in the Chuzi, there is a verse, where actually literally, like it refers to the huan, to the latrine, as kind of moral pollution, of the speaker or the figura in the poem itself. Yeah.
Okay, Anne
Thank
has a
you.
question.
Yeah, and thank you very much, Roel, for this fascinating talk. I like to discuss toilets. So this is great. I have a question on the shape of the toilets that you have shown in the hand tombs. You have the one that is more common, which is the squatting type, but there is also one that's a bit higher. It's like you have two little, I don't know what it is, two little walls. And I remember reading a Chinese scholar's paper, I don't know the name anymore, who suggested that this might be the difference between a female or a toilet used by female users and a toilet used by male people. I don't really follow that. I don't know where it gets the idea from, but I'm wondering what the higher level means, because it's obviously not a toilet to squat on. Do you have an idea?
Mm-hmm. I don't know. I mean, this is really, a question for, for archaeologists. What I do know is that we have a description of various types of latrine in a text known as the Shuming, right? The explanation of names, right? Which says something to the extent that, well, look, when we talk about the toilets, there are various types of them, and then you get 4 or 5 types described, and one of them seems to be describing a type of toilet, that involves, a kind of railing against which you can lean as you bend over or something. But I'm not sure, how to visualize that archaeologically. Perhaps any people here who are archaeologically literate, might have a view on this.
Yeah, I've just been wondering with that type. I could never figure out what it was. My idea was it was someone who could not squat, and so who needed support. So maybe an older person, but I have no idea. I mean, I've been struggling with that one for a long time. And if I may, I have a second question. Actually, you also say subdue the smell. So what products would they have used to subdue the smell? Because you don't only have dirt by touching it. I think that the sense of smelling is somehow understudied in this respect. So do you have an idea how one can do that?
You're absolutely right. I don't find many references to the sensory, sensory assessment, of what surrounds the latrine in the early sources yet. I mean, very, very little, other than these few descriptions that in the Jolie of these officials that need to shoot hole. They need to get rid of everything that smells, but it doesn't really tell you how they do it.
I know from Buddhist sources, but that's later on, of course, that they cover it, and they even try not to have holes, so they cover it with wood and so on. So that, but I don't know, maybe what they would have done before. So I'm just curious. But,
somebody suggesting incense. I don't.
Yeah, but thank you very much. It's fascinating. Thank you.
Okay, then we have a comment from Enno, who in the chat.
Yeah, I saw that, Enno. That's very, that's very useful.
His computer is dying, so he cannot talk,
I mean,
think.
that could potentially be a reference that is a bit obviously earlier than the Fire and Julian. That's very useful. Actually, there's there are much more references in the medieval period. I mean, it's quite clear that for some reason, I mean, the use of the use of slats, and sort of debris, bamboo, right, for sanitary purposes, I assume that this. I mean, that this was known somehow, but it is quite interesting, like to just see the actual evidence both in text and archaeology, in that in fairly late, and then of course when you read up on what scholars familiar with Buddhist sources have done, then it is quite clear that the reference to these things becomes more and more common, and of course it goes all over East Asia, right? In Nara, Japan, there's these samples from Nara, Japan, in which you have the same sort of slats, same principle. But yeah, that's
Okay.
it.
There's a link from Peter Vamos about the modern treatment of the topic, the toilet adventures,
which is wonderful. And actually, I mean, a Chinese scholar named Zhou Xing has just written a monograph on the Dangdai 中国的厕所革命, about the revolution, of toilets, in modern and contemporary China. So I'm sure that modern historians will find a wealth of interesting observations in texts like this.
Okay, then there is from Shanghang. You see, there's a comment or question.
Yeah, well, I don't know. I mean, this is the question that I always have is when, I mean, obviously, feces is used medicinally, right? That's quite clear, the sources, and it's obviously not uniquely Chinese either. But I don't know then, sort of in order to, have the right stuff, for the right treatments, whether that means actually you isolate, particular people, or you put them on a certain diet, right? I know that to produce feces that has one working or the other. I don't know. What I did find fascinating reading up on, work by, Angela Long and some other scholars who did some work on the night soil trade in late imperial China, right? And the people who were doing this, which is a fascinating story itself, that actually the quality of excrement, the quality of human excrement, was actually judged, according to where it came from. That in certain quarters of old Beijing, right, the manure was of better quality than from elsewhere, or that people in Suzhou had a diet, that produced, I suppose, more nitrogen. Produced new manure that was much more useful, on the fields. So there's clearly is that link, obviously, between the quality of the feces and where it comes from and on what diet it's based. But I don't know actually how that functions in the context of Chinese medicine. Whether that means you actually produce you have a hand, so to speak, in generating the right type of feces from the right type of animals fed on a specific diet for the right conditions. I don't know.
Okay, and then we had, I think in order, it was Annette. Her hand is up still.
Yes, hi. I'm sorry for not having my camera on because I'm kind of sitting in my sickbed and don't want to bring you all in here. I might be able to answer Anne's question concerning the different kind of Han Dynasty toilets. The one, I think the one you showed was just a sitting toilet, just the one like this wooden stool. And there's also one where you could just sit on these stone kind of benches. And the other one actually was kind of a device where you could lean on because this makes, of course, the squatting a lot more comfortable. So to say, as for later sources, the Shishwashinu is a really rich source on toilets in later times. And there we have like descriptions on cushions and beds and whatever you can find in a rich man's toilet in these days. And there is also a mentioning of, I think it states in English, yuyubas, what you put into your nose to prevent the stink. So that's what they used, at least in later times, for preventing the stink wherever this came from, maybe from the pigs that were underneath your toilet. So that would be my contribution.
Interesting. Thank you very much.
Thank you. And then Joachim has a question. He typed it in, or a comment.
No, it's not a question. I just wanted to point out that my colleague Huang Xuelei just finished a book on smell in China, and she has a chapter on early texts where she looks at different concepts of smell, different terminology, and so on and so forth. And you might find something on smell in there. Yeah, but it's a very underdeveloped field.
Wonderful. Thank you very much. That's very, very, very good to know.
All right. And then we have Gwen. Comment in the chat box.
I see powdered lime to cover the smell in latrines. It's a great question. I just don't have the answer, I'm afraid. I don't know. I mean, for the period that sort of, I'm most familiar with, there's precious little that I can think of, to help answer this question. Latrines on walls, I mean, if you mean latrines on top of defensive walls, I think that the Mozi is probably the only text that refers to it in the early period. That's why it's always quoted, right? In any article on the latrine in China, Mozi is quoted as the first reference to the public toilet in China, which probably isn't quite true, right? Because people serving on domestic, on defensive walls were soldiers. Not everybody was hanging out there. So, but yeah, I don't know. I mean, I am not aware of any techniques that are used to cover up smell. I think these questions are wonderful, and actually what they tell us is that when it comes down to the sensory history, sensory history as it applies to pre-modern China, we still have quite a way to go, right? It's quite amazing how historians like Alain Corbin and so on have done all this wonderful work on what happened in France and in Paris and so on. And we do, I mean, there's a field there really, for PhD dissertations, like in books and articles to be explored, definitely.
Okay, and I think we have maybe time for two quick questions. So first would be Heini and then Adam.
Hi, Roel. Thank you so much. I just a thought on the senses of smell. Should we consider that probably in the Han, what we consider a bad smell today wasn't necessarily that, and this idea that the smells changed probably over sort of history, but that's just a side thought. I was thinking of the Minchi articles, the pigsty toilet, and I was wondering your thoughts on, can we read more into it, i.e., the meaning. So the pigs obviously wealth and well fed, and it's along with the fact that they're used to for this sort of toilet reason, so that household has this type of facility. Is there ways of looking at it in a more sort of big, larger context than just pure toilet? But
I'm sure there is, and obviously I suppose colleagues like, I mean, Armin Stelbitsky have written about the granary, right? These granaries in the, and of course you need to look at the whole amalgam of these objects, right? What puzzles me, or what intrigues me actually, is the fairly sort of limited period in time in which all of a sudden these things appear. And I may be totally wrong. I don't know. I mean, I don't know whether I'm on top of what's out there in evidence for the medieval period, but it seems to be pretty much, you know, a late Western hand, Eastern hand phenomenon. And then also there is, we can speculate, of course, you know, we can make this link and say, well, it's all, you take all these things into the tomb and so on and so on, but and of course there's a symbolic value attached to them, no doubt.
Excuse me, it's pretty common in the southern dynasties.
Is it? Yeah.
Yes, very common.
Yeah.
So
Okay.
Annette, you don't have to be shy, Annette. Annette published an article on the early medieval figurines models as well.
Okay, well then
I can send you a copy.
Oh, wonderful! Thank you. Yeah.
If I may,
as well. Thanks, Armin.
if I may add to Heine's suggestion, I think you might be onto something there. It's very, very, very often there's a sow suckling piglets in there. So at least there's the idea of regeneration, and in that sense you might be able to read it as well. That might be a good point.
And then you link it with the granary, which contains seeds, you know, which generate new life. And so, yeah, I mean, I'm sure there's some narrative there. You know, there's some intention behind, of course, the use of these objects.
Another dissertation.
Yes. Okay, so very last question, maybe a quick one, hopefully. Adam?
Yes, hi. If I understand Roel correctly, his interest is primarily in the relationship between humans and the pigs, and the toilet part is only the architectural and spatial conduit or setting in which this happens. And I heard you use the word waste somewhere in the beginning, and I'm sure you would agree that the Chinese, especially the farmers who were keeping the pigs, never thought of their excrement as a waste. It's only waste in the, you know, for the court people or for urbanites, but for producers in the primary sector, all these organic materials are fei, right? They literally is fat for the field, fat for the animals, and of course there's a process turning excrement into fei. But I guess in their mind, every little bit has to be staying inside the household compound for their own household animals or field, and never to be, you know, stolen, taken away, or wasted. So and just a question about the Buddhist influence or possible Indian influence. I can't imagine that the Chinese needed the Indians to teach them how to feed dogs and pigs with human excrement. I mean, it just happened, you know, tens of thousands of years ago, or the earliest days of domestication of pigs. No one needed to learn from another civilization about how to use human waste. I mean, human excrement that way. Just thought I needed to say that.
I'll be very brief. You know, my interest in this topic, as I said, you know, it's basically a footnote that's gone out of control. I first got interested in this because, you know, when philosophical texts use these terms, right? You know, like you fertilize, you know, and you put manure on the heart and all the, you know, when they use these things as imagery, then I get really interested in this, and I sort of want to figure out, you know, what they're referring to, and so that's how this came, you know, into being. And of course, the whole interesting thing about it is this dynamic between, you know, something that can be perceived as waste, but it isn't wasted because it is very valuable, right? And that tension is something which you then see, you know, in these various themes in the text, right? I had never thought about, you know, the toilet as this liminal zone in Chinese architecture through which you could actually escape, you know, from a residence or sneak into a residence, and to find all this stuff in calendars, you know, I thought was quite fascinating. And of course, on the waste issue itself, and this is for historians, you know, of the early modern period, it's if I understand it well, in the use of human manure and animal excrement, you know, as an agricultural commodity, as a valuable asset, was really something that set East Asia and India apart, you know, from, you know, Europe. And in European cities, this was only, you know, starting to happen in places like Paris and so on in the early 18th and 19th centuries. And, you know, the early sanitary provisions in cities like London and Paris was to contain these things as wastes. You know, people considered them as waste, and only for a very brief period were they used as an agricultural commodity, because of course chemical fertilizers took over, you know, both in Europe and in North America. So it's interesting that we have these different developments really there, but the tension between it being something that is, you know, that needs to be rejected, that needs to be shed, and at the same time, you know, what we shed turns out to be, you know, the source of what is most valuable, right, in life. That's a fascinating.
Yeah, I just thought maybe a better word would be to produce. You're producing rather than excreting or
right. Yeah.
Thank you.
Thank you.
All right, we're really out of time, so we have to stop here. We're going to continue for a few minutes, maybe 10 minutes afterwards, informally. But so if you want to hang out, then please stay online. But for now, let's thank Roel for the wonderful talk.
Yes, thanks very much, Roel.
Thank you all for your questions.